Winston Churchill was the unbreakable face of Britain's resistance, the man whose words turned fear into fire during the darkest days of World War II. But even giants fall to their knees when the weight of history becomes unbearable. Beneath the steely speeches and defiant cigars, there was a night when the man who inspired a nation finally broke, when Winston Churchill wept. It was a moment the public never saw, yet it revealed the soul behind Britain's most unyielding leader. The summer and autumn of 1940 had transformed London into a burning inferno. Night after night, German bombers rained destruction on homes, factories, and lives. Churchill had walked the ruins, shaking hands with survivors, comforting mothers, and promising that Britain would never bow. But even as he spoke those immortal words, "We shall never surrender," the images of charred streets and lifeless children haunted him. He carried that weight alone. Every decision, every telegram, every order that sent young pilots into the skies or soldiers across the seas, they all lived in his conscience. Churchill had built his reputation on courage, yet courage demands a price. For the first time since the war began, that price was breaking him. Behind closed doors, Churchill rarely allowed emotion to escape. He believed a leader must never show weakness, especially not when the nation's morale hung by a thread. But on one night, amid the rubble of a burning London, the strain broke through the armor. This was not the mighty Churchill of speeches and strategy meetings. It was a man stripped bare by loss, staring into the flames of his own doubts. The Prime Minister who had carried an empire on his shoulders was, for a brief moment, simply human. That night, the night Churchill cried, would mark a turning point in his spirit and in Britain's fight for survival. It was the moment when resolve was reborn, not in defiance but in tears. The night began like so many others during the Blitz, the mournful wail of air raid sirens slicing through the city. German bombers filled the sky, and within minutes, London was engulfed in fire. St. Paul's Cathedral stood like a ghost in the smoke, its dome glowing red beneath the flames. Whole streets vanished under waves of destruction. Churchill watched from the rooftops of 10 Downing Street, surrounded by aides who could see the toll it took on him. He refused to hide in shelters, choosing instead to stand in the open, staring up at the sky where the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury. His bodyguards begged him to take cover. He refused. "I want to see what they are doing to my people," he said quietly. Hours later, Churchill insisted on visiting the bombed districts himself. He climbed into his black Daimler, cigar in hand, and ordered his driver to take him into the East End, the heart of working-class London, where the devastation was worst. As he arrived, the car rolled slowly through streets of smoking ruins, children crying, and families digging through rubble. When Churchill stepped out, the crowd that gathered didn't cheer. They simply looked at him, the man who had promised to protect them, standing among the ashes. Mothers approached him, some silent, others weeping, clutching photos of sons lost to the bombings. One elderly woman grasped his hand and said, "You see, Mr. Churchill? We can take it." The Prime Minister nodded, but his eyes said otherwise. He had seen courage in the faces of ordinary Britons, yet guilt gnawed at him. He was sending brave young men to die in the skies every night, and still, London burned. As he walked away from the crowd, the smoke thickened around him. He turned his face to the sky, and for the first time Winston Churchill felt utterly powerless. Churchill returned to his car in silence, his hand trembling as he lit another cigar that barely stayed between his fingers. His driver glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something few had ever witnessed. The great man's face streaked with tears. Churchill looked out the window at the shattered remains of homes and whispered, "We are finished. We are all finished." For months, he had carried the image of Britain as unbreakable, but that night, amid the destruction, he saw a reflection of his own fragility. Every building that collapsed seemed to echo his self-doubt, every crying child a reminder of promises he could not keep. The war was not just being fought in the skies or seas, it was consuming him from within. At that moment, the emotional toll of leadership reached its peak. Those around him said later that Churchill had always balanced brilliance with darkness. His depression, what he called his black dog, often stalked him quietly, but during the war, it became an ever-present shadow. That night, the black dog sank its teeth deep. He had fought so hard to appear indestructible, but even indomitable spirits can fracture under unrelenting strain. The images of London aflame, mothers sobbing, children's toys buried in rubble, and the faint sound of rescue workers calling for survivors, were too much even for him to bear. Tears began to fall, quietly at first. The man who had faced Hitler's war machine without blinking now sat motionless in the darkness, his face buried in his hands. The tears were not of surrender but of exhaustion, of love, grief, and guilt for the nation he led. Yet even in that moment of despair, something remarkable happened. The tears did not weaken him. They cleared his sight. When Churchill finally raised his head, his eyes were red, but his resolve was harder than ever. Churchill's tears that night did not signal defeat. They marked renewal. What broke inside him was not courage but the illusion of control. He realized then that victory would not come from speeches alone, nor from military might, but from shared suffering. If Britain was to endure, he had to walk alongside his people, not above them. The following morning he called an emergency meeting of his cabinet. He arrived looking haggard, eyes sunken but voice steady. When one minister suggested slowing operations to preserve resources, Churchill slammed his fist on the table. "We will never give up. We shall fight on, with broken bricks if we must," he roared. Behind the fury was a man who had looked into the abyss and found his purpose renewed. His empathy, raw and unfiltered, became his weapon. In every speech thereafter he spoke not as a general commanding troops, but as a father speaking to his children. His words carried the weight of shared pain. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties." His visit to the East End became legendary among those who had witnessed it. Rumors spread that Churchill had cried for them, that he had seen their loss and shared in their grief. Far from diminishing him, it elevated him in the eyes of the people. They saw not a politician, but a man who carried their sorrow as his own. In the weeks that followed, morale began to rise. The nation sensed that if Churchill could endure, if even he could cry and then stand again, so could they. The Blitz continued, but so did Britain's spirit. From that night onward, Churchill's tears became the hidden cornerstone of his leadership, a reminder that true strength is not the absence of pain, but the courage to face it and keep moving forward. Churchill never spoke publicly of that night, but those who knew him said it transformed him. His speeches gained new emotional depth, his empathy sharper, his tone more human. He no longer tried to hide the emotional burden of leadership. He embraced it. In private correspondence to his wife Clementine, he admitted that he had been overcome with the ruin of my people. It was a rare confession from a man who seldom revealed his vulnerabilities. Yet Clementine understood. She had seen the toll war had taken on him. The sleepless nights, the haunted look when casualty reports arrived, the trembling hands when he signed off on military operations. His tears had been cathartic. They allowed him to accept that even the strongest leaders need release, that emotion, when channeled, could forge resilience rather than weakness. Churchill's empathy became the foundation of his leadership in the darkest days of the war. He began visiting bomb sites more frequently, speaking directly to citizens among the rubble, lifting their spirits not with distant authority but with shared humanity. "We shall rebuild," he told them, "and we shall be stronger for it." His words weren't empty, they were born from the night he had stood in those same ruins and wept. The night Churchill cried would remain one of the most private and defining moments of his life. It wasn't a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. It was when Winston Churchill, the wartime lion, rediscovered the strength that comes not from defiance, but from compassion. His tears, unseen by the public eye, were as powerful as his most famous speeches. Because sometimes, even in war, the greatest courage is found not in the roar, but in the quiet moment when a man allows himself to weep. In the weeks following that fateful night, Churchill seemed like a man possessed, not by despair but by a renewed, almost spiritual determination. The Blitz raged on, but something within Britain had changed. The people sensed it first. There was a shift in the air, from weary endurance to quiet defiance. Churchill began visiting bombed neighborhoods more frequently, often without warning. He would appear amid the dust and smoke, hat in hand, walking through shattered streets as if among comrades. The crowds didn't cheer, they simply stared, nodded, and drew strength from his presence. When he spoke to them, it wasn't the voice of the Prime Minister that reached them, it was the voice of a man who had seen their pain and wept for it. "He cried for us," one East End survivor later said, "and that made us love him." Word of his emotional breakdown had spread, but rather than diminish him, it humanized him. Churchill had become one of them, a man enduring loss, fear and sorrow alongside his people. That new bond between leader and nation was unlike anything Britain had known. Churchill's approval wasn't born of charisma or politics, it was born of empathy. His sorrow had become the emotional anchor of a people who refused to yield. At cabinet meetings his fire returned. He barked orders with renewed urgency, planned raids with precision, and delivered speeches that trembled with emotion but burned with conviction. He seemed to draw energy not from victory but from survival itself. In the ruins of a city and the heart of its leader, something profound had been reborn, the unbreakable will of a people who had learned that tears and strength were not opposites, but twins. Though Churchill had found renewed purpose, the cost of leadership continued to crush him. Each day brought new casualty lists, each telegram another wound. Behind every strategic decision lay the ghosts of those who paid the price. His aides often found him pacing his study at odd hours, muttering to himself, sometimes whispering prayers. He would stare at maps covered in red and blue pins, the cold symbols of human lives. Yet in those sleepless nights, Churchill's resolve grew harder. He once told a secretary, "I cannot allow myself the luxury of regret. I can only act." Still, emotion crept through his iron exterior. When reports arrived of a children's hospital destroyed in a bombing raid, he was silent for a long time, then quietly said, "These are my children too." The staff watched him wipe his eyes before turning back to his desk. Churchill understood that leadership in war was not just strategy, it was sacrifice. He bore the collective grief of the nation so that others could carry on. His tears had not weakened him, they had refined him. He had learned to wield empathy as both shield and sword. In the face of unrelenting horror, he began to see his role differently. He was no longer just the voice of defiance, he was the vessel of national sorrow. Every tear he shed in private gave him strength to speak publicly with conviction. And when he spoke, the world listened. Because behind every word of "we shall fight on the beaches," there was a man who had already fought his own war within. Churchill's transformation didn't go unnoticed abroad, especially in Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, himself no stranger to hidden pain, recognized the shift in his British counterpart. Their correspondence, though formal, began to carry a tone of mutual vulnerability. When Roosevelt read Churchill's messages during the Blitz, he sensed not just strategic desperation, but emotional authenticity. Churchill wrote not merely as a statesman, but as a man pleading for his nation's survival. "We are fighting for our lives," he wrote, "and I sometimes fear my strength will not suffice." That rare honesty struck Roosevelt deeply. It was this emotional candor, not military necessity alone, that solidified America's moral commitment to Britain. FDR saw in Churchill a man whose courage was born from pain, and whose leadership was rooted in empathy. When Churchill finally visited Washington in 1941, the two men bonded instantly. Both concealed their frailties behind charm and humor, Churchill with his whiskey and wit, Roosevelt with his quiet strength from the wheelchair. Their friendship became a cornerstone of the Allied effort, one forged not just in politics, but in shared human endurance. One night after dinner, Roosevelt told an aide, "That man has wept for his people. And that's why they will follow him anywhere." Churchill's tears, once a private moment of despair, had rippled across the Atlantic, changing the course of the war through the power of shared humanity. As the war dragged on, victory seemed both closer and infinitely far. Churchill had endured the worst of the Blitz, but new horrors awaited: the North African campaign, the siege of Leningrad, the Holocaust unfolding in grim silence. Each new report weighed heavily on him. He began keeping his emotions locked away again, but they never disappeared. His staff could tell when the weight became too much. His tone would soften, his gaze would linger too long on a photograph of soldiers, or he would spend hours alone in his garden, staring into nothing. There were whispers among his aides that Churchill never truly recovered from that night he cried in the East End. He had simply learned to carry it differently, to turn sorrow into fuel. His tears had burned away doubt, leaving behind an almost spiritual acceptance of his role as Britain's conscience. When news came that British forces had finally turned the tide in North Africa, Churchill celebrated publicly. But that night he reportedly sat alone, sipping whiskey in silence. "So many will never come home," he whispered. His victories were bittersweet. Every triumph carried a shadow, a reminder of the price paid in blood and rubble. His heart, once cracked open by grief, had become the vessel that held a nation's collective pain. And yet, despite the burden, he carried on. Because to stop, to surrender to despair, would mean betraying those who had believed in him when he himself could not. By 1942, the world saw Churchill as the indomitable bulldog of Britain, unflinching, untiring, unbreakable. But few knew that his greatest strength came not from defiance, but from compassion. The night he cried had taught him something no political education ever could: that leadership is not about standing above the people but among them. Every time he addressed the nation, his words carried the heartbeat of shared endurance. "You did your best," he told bombed-out families. "And that is victory enough." His emotional honesty gave Britain its moral backbone. The world admired his eloquence, but the British people loved his humanity. They saw in him not perfection but reflection, their grief, courage and stubborn hope embodied in one weary man with a cigar and a tear-stained past. Churchill's empathy began shaping policy too. He pushed for better care for victims of the Blitz, expanded food programs, and demanded that morale be treated as vital as munitions. He understood that survival was not just physical, it was spiritual. In the end, that night among the ruins became more than a private tragedy. It was the moment Britain found its soul, through the tears of its leader. And in that union of pain and perseverance, a nation discovered that even in its lowest hour, the human spirit could shine brighter than the flames of war. By the time 1944 arrived, Winston Churchill was no longer merely Britain's Prime Minister. He had become a symbol of the free world's will to survive. The tides of war were finally shifting. D-Day was on the horizon and with it, the promise of liberation. Yet behind closed doors, the man who had once wept among the ruins remained burdened by ghosts. Victory, he often said, would bring no joy, only relief. His aides noticed how detached he had become from celebration. Even as news of Allied advances poured in, Churchill seemed somber. He would murmur, "Too many young men, far too many," then fall silent. The war had consumed more than years, it had consumed his peace of mind. In moments of solitude he still recalled that night in the East End. The cries of mothers, the smell of smoke, the sight of London ablaze, they lingered in his mind like scars on his soul. His tears had changed him. They had deepened his compassion but also left him vulnerable to melancholy. Clementine once wrote to a friend, "He is surrounded by applause, yet I fear he feels more alone than ever." And she was right. Leadership during war had made him a hero, but also a prisoner of his own memories. Yet Churchill carried that solitude with dignity. He believed the loneliness of leadership was the price of victory, and he would pay it in full. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, Britain erupted in joy. Crowds filled Trafalgar Square, bells rang and strangers danced in the streets. But inside 10 Downing Street, Winston Churchill sat quietly in his office, staring at the radio. His secretary found him alone, listening to the sounds of celebration. "They're cheering," he said softly, "and they deserve it. But I am thinking of the dead." That night, when the crowds chanted his name, Churchill stepped out to the balcony. He smiled, waved and saluted, the lion of victory. But as he turned back inside, his shoulders sagged. "It is a blessing," he whispered, "that they cannot see how heavy the burden has been." The tears that had once flowed among the ruins of London returned, silently, as he poured himself a small whiskey. They were not tears of sorrow this time, but of exhaustion, the release of 5 years of fear, loss and endurance. He later confided to an aide that he felt no triumph, only emptiness. "It was all necessary," he said. But necessary things are not always joyful. The night he had cried in despair had come full circle. He cried again not because Britain was broken, but because he finally allowed himself to stop holding it together. For the first time in years the weight began to lift. But so too did the purpose that had kept him alive. Without war, he feared, who was Winston Churchill? Peace for Churchill was both a gift and a torment. The wartime urgency that had once driven him now left an aching void. He had been built for storms, not calm seas. In the quiet of post-war Britain, the black dog returned. He began painting again, vast canvases of sunlight over lakes and fields, as if trying to paint himself back into peace. But those close to him knew the shadows still lingered. He spoke often of the dead, the young pilots and soldiers whose sacrifice had made victory possible. "They are my family now," he once said to Clementine, "and they never leave me." When he lost the general election in July 1945, only months after victory, Churchill was stunned. The same people he had led through fire had chosen another leader for peace. He retreated to Chartwell, his beloved countryside home, carrying with him the silence of a man no longer needed. Friends who visited him during those months described a haunting stillness. He would walk the gardens alone, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the distance. Once, when asked if he missed the war, he replied, "I miss the necessity of being needed." In many ways the night he cried had never ended. The tears had stopped, but the ache of carrying an entire nation's suffering stayed with him, a quiet, lifelong echo of the burden of leadership. Years later, when Churchill's wartime diaries were studied, one entry stood out, written during the height of the Blitz. "Tonight I have seen London weep, and I wept with her. Yet in those tears I found the courage to go on." That confession, brief and unguarded, revealed more about the man than all his speeches combined. Historians would come to view that night as the spiritual crucible of his leadership. the moment when Britain's unbreakable will was reborn in the humanity of one man's despair. Churchill never allowed that memory to become public during his lifetime. He believed leaders must appear steadfast. Yet those who served him closest understood that his private tears had saved him from collapse. They were proof that beneath the armor of words and defiance, there beat a profoundly human heart. Decades later, when the story finally emerged, told by one of his bodyguards, the world reacted with awe, not disbelief. The image of Churchill walking through burning London with tears on his cheeks was not one of weakness. It was one of love for his people, his city, and the fragile beauty of courage. And in that revelation, a new portrait of leadership emerged, that even the strongest men are made not by their victories, but by the nights they nearly broke, and chose to rise again. Winston Churchill's tears that night became one of history's most private yet powerful moments. They were never captured in photographs, never broadcast on radio, never recorded in his own words beyond a fleeting diary line. But they changed the course of a nation. When the bombs fell, Churchill's defiance gave Britain hope. But when he cried, he gave it humanity. Those tears taught a wounded people that even heroes could break, and that breaking did not mean surrender. He showed the world that leadership is not the absence of emotion, but the courage to feel deeply and still go on. His tears did not tarnish his legend, they completed it. The lion's roar of 1940 was unforgettable, but the silent weeping of that same man among the ruins gave it soul. In the years after his death, as Britain rebuilt and his statue rose in Parliament Square, few who passed by knew of that night. Yet perhaps, somewhere in the stone's quiet gaze, a trace of that vulnerability remains, the echo of a man who bore his nation's pain, and who, in the darkest hour, found strength in his tears. The day Churchill cried was not the day he failed. It was the day he became the embodiment of everything he had asked of his people: courage, endurance, and humanity. And though history remembers him as the unbreakable lion, those who look closely will see, behind the cigar, beneath the hat, within the eyes, the quiet glimmer of tears that once saved a nation.